Good morning, staff, students, attendants, and most importantly, Royal Canadian military veterans and service people. Welcome to this year's Centennial College Remembrance Day ceremony, where we honor those who have fought and served for our beloved nation and who sacrificed the greatest gift to ensure our freedom to this day and onwards. My name is Nicholas Davies Hall, a second-year broadcasting student here at Story Arts Center. Our ceremony will include multiple speakers, including veterans and other individuals. We understand that due to our school being home to many international students, not everyone knows what Remembrance Day is. So it is important to explain why Remembrance Day is the day that it is, and to inform those who may not know the history of Canada's involvement in world conflicts and how it affects our present day. Canada's Royal Military has had its fair share of involvement in many of history's largest conflicts, and important moments during all of them that directly affected the outcome of each. World War I marked the first of Canada's military sending troops to aid Allied forces in their fights against the Central Powers. Being part of the British Commonwealth essentially thrusted them into battle when the British declared war on Germany in August of 1914, where they sent an initial 25,000 troops across the Atlantic to fight. 619,000 Canadians enlisted in the Army by war's end in 1918, which, for a population of 8 million at the time, was an astronomical number. Canadians fought at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, aided in the Somme in 1916, and played heavy roles in both Passchendaele and Vimy Ridge in 1917. By the time the Treaty of Versailles was signed in June of 1919, 60,000 Canadian soldiers lost their lives, with an additional 170,000 returning greatly injured and damaged from the war itself. It was a monumental time in history for Canada's position and worldview, and proved to the British that they had a position of autonomy when it came to world issues. World War II provided its own set of challenges for the Canadian Army. Canada was allowed to decide its own declaration of war, which they exercised on September 9, 1939. Though their status amongst nations after World War I was bolstered, they were still considered a middle power due to financial capabilities and population. That didn't stop them, however, from being key figures in multiple efforts around the globe. Canadians were sent to Hong Kong to aid in the defense against the Japanese, and later sent to Sicily, Italy, to further push into Europe. All of these efforts climaxed in Canada being part of one of the largest and most taxing invasions in modern warfare history, the attack on Juno Beach in France, D-Day, June 6, 1944. 14,000 Canadians landed or parachuted into France on that fateful day in June, with 359 losing their lives both on the battlefield and later on from injury. The mission was a success, and the Canadian Army prevailed in helping secure Normandy and France from the Axis forces. In total, throughout the campaign, 44,000 Canadian service people lost their lives in the war, a smaller total than that of the First World War, but in no way less devastating. While not directly involved in the conflicts, the Canadian government sent troops across the Pacific to the Korean War, which saw the North and South of Korea fighting against one another for what they believed would be the best way to run the nation after the Second World War, either that of a communist nation or of democracy. In 1950, as part of United Nations forces and peacekeeping efforts in what would become the third bloodiest conflict Canada was involved in, 26,791 Canadian military personnel were sent to aid in both the combat phase as well as peacekeeping afterwards. The first Canadian unit landed in November of 1950, and in May 1951, 2 more were sent over to join the fight. After the armistice between the north and south sides of Korea was signed in 1953, signifying the end of the conflict, 516 Canadians died due to the war, along with an approximate 1,200 injured and 32 taken as prisoners of war. The Vietnam War was the second instance of Canadians helping our neighbors to the south with violent conflicts. From 1954 to 1975, 10,000 Canadian soldiers volunteered to join the United States Army, while other Canadian corporations supplied war material to the U.S. government. Despite Canada not sending their own troops, their impact on the United States' stance in the Vietnam War was evident, with Canadian corporations having contributed $2.5 billion in war material and another $10 billion in food and supplies. 134 Canadians died serving the U.S. in Vietnam, far less than any other war, but with just as profound an impact. The September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks sparked Canada's next involvement in war, with the United States invasion of Afghanistan. This would lead to Canada being actively involved in missions in the Middle East from 2001 to 2014, where they would send a total of 40,000 over that period to aid in both fights and rehabilitation efforts. They would spend $2.2 billion on building Afghanistan back from their war-torn image, providing funding to non-government organizations for food, education, and basic human needs, as well as frequent polio vaccination sites and the rebuilding of damaged infrastructure. 158 Canadian soldiers lost their lives serving in Afghanistan, with an additional 2,000 suffering injuries as well. An investigation by the Globe and Mail would reveal that 175 Canadian troops that were deployed in Afghanistan took their own lives returning home. And other hard years of 2000 and 2000. Over the years, Canada has worked with the United Nations in peacekeeping operations around the globe, aiding conflicts that other nations are involved in without adding to the bloodshed. Since 1954, Canada has sent a total of 125,000 peacekeeping troops across the globe, including the Republic of Congo, Cyprus, Syria, Somalia, Rwanda, and many others. 130 Canadians have sacrificed themselves protecting others over time, helping protect others' human rights, restore rule of law, and help rehabilitate political order. If it wasn't made apparent already, Canada has done a lot and given up a lot more for us to be able to enjoy the freedom we share in this great nation today. We are gathered here today to remember the left of their home lives, to run headfirst, no questions asked, into the unknown for the sole purpose of saving something they truly cared about by any and all means necessary. People left family, friends, and loved ones, and sacrificed themselves to ensure others could go home and continue to enjoy their lives with those they cared about. As we gather here today, we hold in our hearts the courage, the sacrifice, and the boundless dedication of those who came before us. Remembrance Day is more than just a date on the calendar. It is a solemn promise to honor the memories of those who gave their lives so we could stand here together, free and full of hope. It's a day to pause and reflect on the profound legacy of service and the freedoms we so often take for granted. We remember not just the names etched in stone, but the lives behind them, the stories of resilience, bravery, and commitment to something far greater than themselves. Each one of those individuals left behind loved ones, dreams, and aspirations, all in service of a world that could live in peace. As we stand in silence and remembrance today, thank those who served and continue to serve so that we may stand together once again in lasting memory and carry their light forward, lest we forget.
Mike, there we go. Good morning, everyone. We are going to put ourselves into the hands of the floor director in just about 2 minutes here. I do want to say that, just so people know, I have what's called essential tremors. So I am my own bobblehead, And I'm actually very blessed because I have it in the head, and 90% of the people have it in the hands. So I always consider myself blessed. And it's my own fault because when I was covering a Blue Jay game in 2005, I turned to the person next to me on bobblehead day and said, wouldn't it be great to be a bobblehead? And the message got a little messed up north. So we're just going to wait for, we're all set here, and we're in the hands now of the floor director, and as soon as she gives me the sign, then we're off. Good morning, and welcome to the 2024 Remembrance Day ceremony here at the Story Arts Center. We begin by welcoming Ms. Chelsea Antonio of Centennial College's Music, Industry, and Performance Program to lead us in the singing of O Canada.
Oh, Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all of us commend. With glowing hearts we see thee rise, the true north, strong and free. From far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God, keep our land glorious and free. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
As always on these affairs, the weather changed and the wind has come up. So don't worry about the stuff blowing around you. This is quite common for these days. Color Guard retreat.
Color party. All out. Color party.
Thank you. Be seated, please. Well, here we are again, as we have been every year in this country since 1921. Today marks the beginning of Remembrance Day weekend here in Canada, and the 8th is highly significant, the Friday, because across Canada today is Aboriginal Remembrance Day, where all of our First Nations communities get together and remember those from those communities who gave their lives in all of Canada's wars. It is also a time where, personally for me, I have a chance to remember again one of my great heroes, Tom Longboat. Tom Longboat was one of the most famous athletes in the world in 1907 when he won the Boston Marathon. He was a tremendous runner. When World War I started, he volunteered for service in the Army, and they made him, obviously, a runner, which was a very dangerous job, because everybody tried to pick off each side's runners, because the idea is that if you killed the messenger, you killed the message. And he survived all of those. He survived many years in the trenches and eventually was wounded. One of the great stories from his time in the war, as he, ran bravely from one place to another, delivering messages, a colonel stopped him and said, "Who do you think you are, Tom Longboat?" And he said, "Yes, sir, I am Tom Longboat." He was wounded. He was wounded and survived and stayed to continue the fight until afterwards, and came home and lived a long life afterwards. So we honor him. Today I would like to recognize a few guests. Dr. Neil Bedell, one of our school vice presidents who has joined us today. Our dean, Nate Horowitz, who's joined us today. And also, it's an interesting thing, because when you talk to people, you find stories that are so interesting. Just yesterday, in talking with Gillian Edwards, we discovered that her grandfather, an engineer, had worked as a civilian during the Second World War on very, very secret projects. So secret that he went to his grave and never told anybody what he had worked on, even 50 years later. I also would like to note Laura Kittner, who is my direct boss here. Laura's son, Jack McConkey, is currently serving with the Royal Canadian Navy out west, and we honor his service. It was actually Joseph Stalin who said, "The death of one person is a tragedy. The death of 10,000 is a statistic." So the statistics are that, just to take one example, in the Second World War, there were 47,000 Canadians who died, and 100,000 total casualties in a country of 15 million. Those are statistics. And so we often, when we come to Remembrance Day, we often will talk about remembering the group, and that is altogether correct. But I have dedicated myself for the rest of my life to telling the stories of individuals, because that's where the true story is. It's in the individuals who went off to war, whether it be the First World War, the Second World War, Korea, Afghanistan, where 40,000 of our troops served, or in Bosnia, or in Sarajevo. The people that we lost. If we can take the time to get to know one or two of them, who they were, what they believed, what they loved, where they lived. It is my great honor and privilege that I have taken on the job in time for my high school's 100th anniversary in 2027, East York Collegiate. I have taken on the job of researching and writing 600-word historical vignettes on all 125 young men who gave their lives. We are up down to 58, and we're going to get there. And the number 57 was a young man who died in the Air Force, who lived directly across the street from here. Green Door. When you come out, if you see the green door, that was where he was from. So what we're going to do today is we are going to talk about some individuals, and we're going to meet our special guests. Our theme today on the 100th anniversary of the Royal Canadian Air Force is the Royal Canadian Air Force Women's Division, which probably has had like the least amount of books written about it, of memories told of it. But it is a tremendous story. It is a story of 17,000 young women who joined up, and 41 of them who gave their lives. Their inspiration came from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force in Britain, which at its height had 178,000 people in it, 1,000 women in it, who served all over the world, and were very often in combat situations, because in the WAF, they lived and worked at air bases that were often under attack, especially in the Battle of Britain. During the Battle of Britain, from August 18th to August 30th at Biggin Hill Aerodrome near London, the aerodrome was wiped out by Germany's Luftwaffe. And during that time, those 12 days, 3 women in the WAFs won military medals. 3 of the 6 that were awarded during the entire war. But there is a saying, they also served those who sat and wait, those who sat and typed. And the Royal Canadian Air Force Women's Division, they worked mostly in air bases here in Canada in what was called the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, and working air bases. And they did all the jobs the WAFs did. The difference was they weren't being attacked, thank God. But they did everything literally, from cleaning floors and making meals and washing up dishes, to manning switchboards and driving trucks and driving tractors and bombing up and working with munitions and being air crew. And I wish today, in a short way, to remember 3 of them. We remember today leading aircraft woman Alice Lovina Anderson. Alice was from the Chippewas of Rama First Nations. She was born September 28, 1923 in Rama. She was the daughter of Christopher and Jane Anderson. She had 1 brother, Erwin. She had 4 sisters, Verna, Corinne, Christine, and Gail. She went to school in Uxbridge, Ontario, and I want to find out more about that if I can, but she went to school in Uxbridge, Ontario, which was 50 miles away. And then she went to Shaw's Business College here in Toronto. She was working as a waitress when she enlisted. She enlisted on January the 22nd, 1943, at 19 years old, to the Royal Canadian Air Force Women's Division. And she ultimately, and she worked while she was on it, general duties, she worked in the canteen, but she also worked down on the flights. And on the flight, she was a timer, which is a job as an aviation nutcase I just absolutely fascinated with, because her job was, and you have to think about a busy air base training the 200,000 airmen that we trained in the Second World War. Planes are just going out like this. And her job was to, was to make sure that Harvard 4254 went off at 11:07, was due back at 12:17, that it actually got back. So you logged it out, logged it back. It was a tremendously important job because, as you can imagine, every once in a while, it didn't get back. And then you picked up the phone and say, we have an emergency, folks. She was transferred to Uplands in the spring of 1945. And somewhere in there, and her records are all on Ancestry, but somewhere in there, Alice came in contact with somebody in the office who had tuberculosis. And she caught it. She was engaged. All she wanted was it says right in her records that what she wanted was to be married, have children. But she caught TB. And they eventually, in early 1946, sent her to a sanitarium in Windsor, Ontario, which of course is very far away from her family. And she died. And today we remember her. Today we remember Frances Schofield. Frances was born at Nicto Falls in Nova Scotia, and she was brought up the family eventually, when she was 7, moved to Chester Basin, which is a small village to the west of Halifax. She loved dancing, she loved reading, she loved skating. She finished grade 11, and she had 2 of her 3 brothers who were already in the Army, so she joined the Royal Canadian Air Force Women's Division in March of 1943. Following Manning Depot, they sent her to No. 9 Bombing and Gunnery School, which was in Montjoly, Quebec, which is, if you look at a map and you see the top part of New Brunswick, then just into Quebec, and you'll see it's right there on the south side of the St. Lawrence River. Her RCAF reports in her records are sterling. And every job that she did super well. She was a clerk. And she's listed as outstanding every 3 months. Outstanding, 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 outstanding. In April of 1945, the war was coming to an end in Europe. And she was owed leave. So she chose to take the leave. She chose to take the leave, and on April the 22nd, 1945, she boarded a passenger train called the Scotian, which was the milk train. And it took a very long time for you to get there. From there to get back to the Halifax area, even though it doesn't look a long way on the map. You have to understand that the railways were completely packed at that time because of the war. They got into Fredericton Station just after midnight. And finally they pulled out. And they put the train, they came to Painsec Junction, which is just on the north side of the International Airport, John Munro International Airport, not Munro, I'm sorry, beg your pardon, of the International Airport in Fredericton. So it's just to the north of there. And they moved her train, her passenger train, onto a siding to allow a freight train to come the other way. which was actually on the opposite track from where it's supposed to be, but they just had to jam these trains in. And as the freight train came by, 3 of the cars derailed on the freight train. And they leaned over and they crashed down the side of the train. 51 people were injured. 9 of them very badly, 3 critical. They all survived. 1 died. It was Frances. And she was buried with full military honors in Chester Basin. And her pallbearers were all members of the Women's Division. And we remember her. We remember Section Officer Irene Watson, Women's Division, and this one has always been a very personal one for me. Section Officer Watson was from New Toronto, which is what you would know of as South Etobicoke. So if you're ever along the lakeshore and you see 1st Street, 2nd Street, 3rd Street, 4th Street, that's New Toronto. She was a tremendous athlete, a tremendous leader. She was a graduate of Mimico High School. She was taking courses at the University of Toronto. But what she really wanted to be was a journalist. So she had a job at the New Toronto Advertiser as a journalist. And please remember, 1940, 1941, to be a young woman wanting to be a journalist, when for the most part, if you were a woman journalist, you could be one of the 2 or 3 people who could be a foreign correspondent, or you could work on the women's section. But she was determined she was going to be a journalist. And she also got a job as a stringer with the Globe and Mail. But she wanted to join up, so she joined the Royal Canadian Air Force Women's Division. Because of Irene's skills as a journalist, they decided that what she would be really good at would be a recruiter. So they trained her to be that. And they sent her overseas. Now, overseas at that point also meant Newfoundland, because Newfoundland did not become part of Canada until 1949. So she goes over to Newfoundland, and she's in charge of all of the recruiting in Newfoundland in 1943, and she's a section officer, which is a pretty high rank. She had to go up to Botwood Bay to meet with some of her employees, and they had two choices. She could take what was called at the time the Newfie Express, which went from St. John's to Botwood, which would take 12 hours. But somebody came to her and said, look, we have an extra spot here on a Canso flying boat, which in the United States is known as a Catalina. And there were 9, they piled 9 people on this with the 5 crew, but this all happened so quickly that there were only Mae West life preservers for 5 people, the crew. So the crew gave up their life preservers to some of the passengers, one of which was Irene. And she spent the whole flight in the navigator's cabin learning to navigate, because that was what she was like. But when the plane was, not the Air Force, when the plane was coming in to land on the water at Botwood, it caught a wing and did what's called a ground loop and was left with just the tail sticking up. Afterward, they were able to determine that all 5 people who were wearing life jackets died, and the 9 people that weren't got out. And the reason is because they pulled the tabs on their life jacket and inflated their Mae West life jacket, and they floated up into an air pocket on the aircraft as it was sinking, and they couldn't get out of the air pocket. And you can imagine, too, it's pitch black. And Irene went down with the aircraft, and she died. They never found the aircraft, so she's still there. And we remember her today for her sacrifice. One moment, please. Now, just one moment, please. Sorry about that. Okay, it's time to meet our honored guest today. We're actually going to do this the opposite way that you normally do this, where you start with the lower rank and you go to the higher rank. But in order for us to tell the story, we're going to do this. Sir, if you would stand. Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, I am proud to have with us today Honorary Colonel John Wright. John Wright, some of you may recognize John. He spent a lifetime in the polling business, and we saw him a lot on television oftentimes. Colonel, I had a look at your resume, and I know you didn't want to talk about this, but we're going to talk about just a little bit, okay? I had a look at your resume. The voluntary service that you have done with the Air Force goes 4 pages. And we thank you for that. You are here for a different reason today. But I wonder if you could just take a minute to talk about one of them that popped out at me, which is the fact that you were the co-founder of the Canada Company. Could you please explain what the Canada Company is?
Sure. And thank you. Malcolm and I went to university together, and so he's far more prestigious and doing better work than I am on a daily basis. Canada Company was formed in 2006. It was formed by Blake Goldring, who is the chair of AGF, with one mission 10 of us had, and that was to provide free education for those children whose parents died in Afghanistan. There were 158 who lost their lives then. It was then expanded for those who had lost their lives in Bosnia, and then for what's called military attributable death, which can either be death by their own hand or by an accident or by some other means. Since 2014, we've had another 50 of our Canadian troops who have died. So 208 since Afghanistan started. And while we remember those who were in World War I and World War II, that's much closer to us. And so we've given out scholarships for 18 years. We've seen them leaving high school to go to university and college. It's been one of the most incredible moments of my life to see that happen, because we all can serve in many ways. It doesn't have to be in uniform, but the most important is with the families who are affected by these sort of circumstances.
It's a wonderful thing, and that we might not just remember those who gave their lives, but the families as well, who oftentimes, of course, are put into very difficult economic circumstances when they lose one of the parents because of war. But we're going to now talk about somebody pretty amazing. We're going to talk about your aunt, Lillian Nisbet, and what a career she had. Just in general, just to get it started, your aunt was one of the very first female parachutists in Canada, used to do air shows all over the point. And then afterward, and then when the war came, she joined the Royal Canadian Air Force and was a meteorologist and served all across Canada. And perhaps if you could give us a few memories of her time in the WDs, but also her time as a crazy parachutist.
I think our family trait is obsessive compulsiveness. We just keep going and doing many things. My grandfather was in the First World War, served all 4 years, but his story began with going to the Battle of the Somme in Delville Wood, where he was wounded bad enough to be shipped home. So he was home for a short period of time and then signed up again to be with the Royal Artillery and then to be with his brother until his brother was killed in 19 days before the end of the war. But I guess when he was home, he enjoyed the company of the family, because in later 1917, my aunt was born. And it was an interesting circumstance where, in fact, she was taken, the family being Catholic, was actually taken to a Protestant place to be baptized because of a Zeppelin raid. She went on to not only be one of the first parachutists, but became the first female parachutist, but one of the first, she was the first female parachute packer, first meteorologist who was female. And when she finished with the Royal Canadian Air Force, she went on to be a union leader, a teacher, and a founder of Amnesty International. there was something about that era where this 5'4" woman who always wanted to fly the plane instead kept jumping out of them, but continued community service. So we honor her today, and she was an amazing individual.
Your dad told you a story about one time when she jumped out of a plane and things didn't quite go as planned.
Greenwood Racetrack, 1940, ended up on the front page of the Toronto Star. Jumped out of an aircraft at Greenwood with the Prime Minister there. She fell 800 feet before it opened, with 200 feet left to go, and landed in the water. So it was, you know what, they were an amazing people. If you look at the movies with all of the women of that time, she was cut from the same cloth, and it was a remarkable moment.
And when you think about the women's division, you think about your aunt as a symbol of that, what sorts of things do you think about?
Well, I think about the life that she led of service and sacrifice, but she was always telling us in our family that it was the family of the people who served which were most important. And when you think about it today, if we have troops who move from city to city like they normally do, they have to bring families with them. They go to the back of the healthcare line. They stand in line for a doctor just like you and I would. They may lose money on their house that they have to sell or have to rent somewhere else. They leave with their kids and their kids' friends. They oftentimes, the spouse doesn't have a job where they're going to. These are all things that we can help with, and I think that's the thing she instilled, that it's not just the battlefield and those who wear the uniform that matter, it's the people who stand beside them and behind them, and we can help them as a form of service to those who stand in front of them.
Thank you, Colonel. And joining us from Barrie, it's Major Andrea Sloan. Major Sloan was originally from the Sault Ste. Marie, and went to Queen's University, and then you got your MBA from York University, and joined the RCAF Reserves. And why did you join the Reserves?
Well, it was actually my mother's idea. I needed a job in high school, like everybody, and she suggested going to this summer youth employment program that was run by the local artillery unit in the Sault, the 49th Field Regiment. So I trained with them for the summer, then I got out and went to university to train as a teacher. When I came back to do an internship placement with my old elementary school, lo and behold, the principal of the school was also the deputy commander of the RCA of the 49th Field Regiment there. So I joined as the first female officer in that unit. Then later on, when I moved to Toronto, I ended up transferring into an Air Force unit. So that's where my RCAF career started.
You have spent, this just blows my mind. You spent 39 years in the reserves. 39. And including that is 23 in the full-time reserves. And just so you know, if you're in the full-time reserves, at any time you can pick up the phone and go, hello, and you're on your way somewhere if they need you. Now, your job was a very special one that people don't really know about, really, if they don't study military history or understand the military. Your job was logistics. Could you explain what that is?
Well, logistics actually comprises supply, transport, food services, administration. I joined and was trained as a supply officer and ended up doing the majority of my career in administration. That's, you just adapt and carry on. And it's, as Napoleon said, an army marches on its stomach, and so what he was referring to was all of the underpinnings there required to get them there and make sure they're fed when they're doing their thing. And in fact, my logistics training in the Army actually got me my civilian jobs, because when I couldn't get a job in teaching right away, I started applying for jobs in logistics and wound up doing that as a civilian career until I became full-time in the Air Force. So I really enjoyed it. I kind of like getting things from where they were to where they're supposed to be. As a supply officer, I thought it was like Christmas all the time. You're always receiving the stuff you asked for and giving it out to people who want it. So what could be better than that?
And you did a combat tour in Bosnia with a helicopter unit. What did you do there?
I was the adjutant for the helicopter squadron, which was located in Velika Kladuša in northern Bosnia. So at that time they were supporting the peacekeeping forces that were there with NATO. And as the adjutant, I was sort of the senior administrative officer looking after the personnel. We had a lot of people moving in and out. They had started 56-day tours so that reservists and people who had family commitments could come and participate for a shorter time. So there was a lot of people coming and going and keeping track of them and so on. So that was quite an interesting job.
And you took some time off. You took a 2-year leave, and of course, when some people take a 2-year leave, they go and lie on a beach somewhere. You didn't do that. You went for the United Nations, and this is your United Nations now. And where did you go for the United Nations?
This was in the summer of 1994, and again, I had been laid off from my civilian job, so I happened to find out about these people that were hiring civilians to work overseas in the UN operation over in Yugoslavia. So I thought, hey, why not give that a try? I'm supposed to be trained for that on the military side, so why don't I give it a shot? And I ended up getting hired to be the logistics coordinator for the engineering services over there. And the UN, that was a much larger mission than they had ever done before. So they were able to find military engineers to do things like build bridges and clear mines and stuff like that. But what they needed also was people to do the maintenance of the camps and minor road building and things like that. So they created a civilian engineering service. So when I went over there, I had the chance to work with some serving Canadian military that were involved in the planning and approval side, and a lot of ex-Australian military were there, plus people from Finland and all over, really. So that was a great opportunity. And the funny thing is, the first day, within 24 hours of arriving there, I met 2 people that I had known through my Canadian military service from training courses and so forth. And then in the rest of the 3 years or so that I was over there, I never met anybody else that I had known from before, but it made me feel at home right away.
And ma'am, when I pre-interviewed you, you said something that just struck me. As when we tie all of this back to the women's division and what they did to begin the to begin the tradition, or a new tradition, of women in our armed forces. And I should point out, by the way, that in 1980, Canada became the first NATO nation in the world to train female fighter pilots. Like, it's incredible what our women have done in the Royal Canadian Air Force. But you said something to me that when you were very young and you saw the officers there, that just really surprised you.
Yeah, it wasn't so much in my youth, but seeing female officers later on in my military career made me realize, during the early stages, of course, being the first female officer in my militia unit, there was a service battalion alongside that had them, but I wasn't used to seeing female officers that outranked me particularly. So later on in my career, when I was a captain and I started to see female majors and women being appointed as unit commanders and so forth, it really struck me then how much I had not seen that earlier on. So it made me realize that it's important for everybody to be able to see people that are like them in some way, to give them something to aspire to.
And finally, when you think about what the WDs did, what does it make you think when you think of how they served in the Second World War?
Makes me very proud, makes me hope that whatever I've done has been at least partly as impactful as what they did. In the end, you look at what your impact is on the people that you're working with and working for day to day, and hope that you can live up to that grand past that we have.
Major, thank you so very much for your service. Color guard to the front. We are deeply honored and proud that our color guard today comes from the paramedic program here at Centennial College under the command of under the command of Michael Thomas, who is the program coordinator there. And to be able to continue to have the involvement of our students in this day is something that makes me very proud of our school, and we thank them for being here. We now move to the very traditional part of the program, there will be things for you to do standing up, but I wanted to explain before we begin about the last post, the minute of silence, the lament, and the rouse. The last post, which is the first one that you will hear, was first used in the 1790s in the British Army. What the last post does is it calls the end of the day. In this case, what it does is it recognizes the end of the combat day, and it recognizes those who are coming back to camp and those who never will. It is a very somber tune. We are honored today to have Ji Young Kim from the University of Toronto Music Program, which always provides our trumpeters, and we're very pleased to have those. After that, we'll have 1 minute of silence, and then Scott Greenaway, who is our Centennial College piper, and many of you may recognize Scott from Convocation and all the other things that he's done. Scott will play the lament, and I'm always moved in two ways because the pipes go back thousands of years. We know that the Egyptians used airbag instruments to play. They have been traditional all over the world, especially in the north part of North Africa, in Thailand, and in many other places around the world. So they are a world instrument. And of course, the Scots and the Irish. After that, we will hear the rouse. The rouse is very short. And what the rouse is, it is basically calling the dead to come and gather together in order to go to heaven. So we begin now with the last post. Please stand. Raise the colors. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome from our broadcast and film program, please welcome with the act of remembrance, Karen Shopsowitz.
They shall grow not old, so that we are left, so we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them. Ladies and gentlemen, before we move along to Flanders Fields, I wish to correct an error. And the error was that is the missing land acknowledgement. And it is so very, very important today because we are not only standing on the lands of the Mississauga, but we are honoring those from all of our people across, our First Nations people from across the land. So we shall do it now. Centennial College is proud to be a part of a rich history of education in this province and in this city. We acknowledge that we are on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and pay tribute to their legacy and the legacy of First Peoples of Canada as we strengthen ties with the communities we serve and build the future through learning and through our graduates. Today, the traditional meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the communities that have grown in the treaty lands of the Mississauga. We acknowledge that we are all treaty people and accept our responsibility to honor all of our relations. Would you have a seat, please? I'm very dry here, sorry. In 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, a young surgeon from Montreal who had just finished 36 consecutive hours of surgery right in the front of the trenches, of the hell of the trenches, he came out to take a break. This man's name was Dr. John McCrae. And he was so moved by what he saw because when he came out and he looked at the devastation around him of no man's land, he noticed that the poppies were still growing. And it struck him that that meant that no matter what happened, that we would go on. So he took out a pad of paper and a pencil, and he wrote a poem right off the top of his head. There are two different stories of what happened next, but the story that is now the most accepted one is that a communications man from Uxbridge came by and said, "What do you have there, sir?" And he said, "Oh, it's a poem. It's not very good. Here, you can have it." And he gave it to him. And when the communications man read it, he was incredibly moved himself. And he sent it off to Punch magazine in London. And they published it. And it became the most famous poem of the First World War, and a poem that has still stayed with us for more than 100 years. John McCrae did not survive the war. He died of pneumonia just shortly after being made the commanding officer of all Canadian medical units in France. He died. And this is his story. This is his poem. In Flanders fields the poppies blow beneath the crosses, row on row, that mark our place. And in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up the quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our ceremony today. The last thing that we will be doing is I will ask the, there's two last things that we'll be doing. First of all, I welcome Chelsea Antonio. So we're not quite finished. I welcome Chelsea Antonio back, please. And it was very interesting last year because it was the first time we had ever done God Save the King. So we welcome Chelsea Antonio back to do God Save the King. If you would stand, please.
God save our gracious King. Long live our noble King. God save the King. Send him victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save the King.
Now we ask that the color party form and that they lead our special guests out. If you would please stay on your feet until the color party has left and has arrived back over here, I'd appreciate it. And in case anybody, excuse me, and in case anybody noticed, I did actually say send her victorious. It was such a long time.